So, freedom of expression on the internet has been a huge topic in Canada lately, and for good reason. Freedom of expression is a charter-protected right and should be respected. With Bill C-11, we saw a major controversy surrounding whether or not it was a censorship bill. Bill C-11 was, in fact, not actually a censorship bill. However, because of the way it was structured, it suppressed smaller content creators on platforms like YouTube in favor of the right-wing establishment media and legacy broadcasters, as those groups were the only ones who can truly provide proof that their content was, quote, CanCon enough. Today, we're going to discuss how Meta and Google have inadvertently started to fuel Pierre Poilievre and his victim complex agenda. Welcome to Orange Wave, the series where we discuss progressive news, culture, and all things related to the NDP. I'm your host, Will Adams, and regulating the internet when it's done in a fashion that affects what users see in search results, what we see in social media algorithms, is a clear, slippery slope into not only less digital freedom for consumers, but also plain government censorship. We're seeing it all the time, with India and parts of the EU banning encrypted messaging apps, with America trying to create a law that would require proof of address to even be allowed to post on platforms like Instagram, Twitter, or Threads, and the aforementioned Bill C-11, a law created in Canada to assist dying legacy broadcasters in an era where consumers on platforms like YouTube are watching more independent creators. Even when it's not designed as censorship, it gives the government more control over things that it doesn't need to and probably shouldn't have control over. Today, we are going to be looking at the latest piece of legislation surrounding this controversial topic. So Bill C-18, or the Online News Act, as summarized in the bill itself, quote, aims to regulate digital news intermediaries in order to enhance fairness in the Canadian digital news marketplace and contribute to its sustainability. It establishes a framework through which digital news intermediary operators and news businesses can enter into agreements regarding news content made available by these intermediaries. So the advertised purpose of Bill C-18 is to create a level playing field within the digital news sector. The goal is to ensure the sustainability and diversity of the Canadian news ecosystem. At surface level, that sounds pretty great and something that should be cheered on. But there's a bit more to it than just that. For a start, the reason this bill exists at all is because two companies, Facebook parent company Meta and Google, have been asked to pay Canadian news outlets for using the links to their websites on platforms like Google, Facebook, any of these platforms. Of course, Meta and Google don't want to pay a link tax, so they are pulling news services from their platforms in Canada altogether. Of course, the right-wing establishment media is, as always, misrepresenting this as a speech issue that will affect the ability of individuals to share information without excessive regulation, which is not the case whatsoever. That's not what this is about. But this bill still isn't something I see as a great thing, at all. In fact, I actually think it's quite bad. Really bad. For a lot of people, in fact. And I'll explain why. So, I think it's important to mention that supporters of the bill have been arguing that Bill C-18 helps address the power imbalances between tech giants and news publishers by requiring, quote, fair compensation for news content shared on digital platforms like Instagram, Facebook, etc. However, in my personal opinion, the argument doesn't really fit, considering the fact that the increased regulations due to how Facebook and Google are handling the situation, it is hindering innovation and hindering the ability of smaller news organizations to compete effectively with bigger players. It's slowly creating a situation where only a few large players can dominate the digital news market, leaving little room for smaller outlets to thrive. Seeing as most people know about CBC, Rebel, National Post, etc., and can actually just go to their website. But a smaller competitor right now is suffering due to the bigger players wanting a bigger cut of money. I also don't see the argument working, as the news orgs asking for this are the bigger ones anyways, when they have the power in the news industry in Canada. So what we actually have is a bill that claims to want to make Canadian news on the internet more sustainable, but it doesn't do that whatsoever. It actually hurts the news organizations, as they'll get more ad revenue if they can appear in Google's algorithm. This law prevents that in a very ignorant manner. I do not believe that the news orgs that pushed for this and the lawmakers that approved it actually understand how this stuff works. I'd go as far as to say that they are really out of touch here. But trust me, I think it only gets worse from here. One fundamental aspect to this that concerns me quite a bit is surrounding the topic of misinformation and disinformation. It's a known fact that nowadays, a significant portion of the population in Canada and around the world rely on social media platforms like Facebook for their daily consumption of news. They also rely on the algorithms with platforms like Google. And here lies the bigger problem, at least in my opinion. If news services are halted, which they are planned to be in Canada, it inadvertently creates a situation where false information can easily gain prominence while masquerading as legitimate news. This issue is extremely worrisome, as it hampers our ability to fact check and verify the accuracy of information shared on these platforms properly. With news services being unavailable, the task of distinguishing fact from fiction on the internet becomes a way bigger pain in the ass for the average person than it needs to be. It might not be obvious at first, but what's at stake here is the public's understanding and perception of important topics. Allowing false information to potentially flourish under the guise of being credible news poses a significant risk to society. It can lead to increased polarization. It can lead to widespread ignorance and a dangerous erosion of trust in reputable news sources. This bill should be prioritizing addressing the challenge of misinformation by implementing provisions that encourage platforms of this kind to take responsibility for curating accurate news content and combating the spread of fake news, rather than brown-nosing the legacy broadcasters and making fact-checking even harder than it already is. We should be facilitating an environment where platforms incentivize reliable information and prioritize media literacy. We need to equip people with the skills necessary to critically evaluate the information presented to them at any given moment. Enhancing media literacy and digital literacy should be a crucial aspect of this bill, so that way we don't have more situations that lead to our capital being under siege by domestic terrorists and vice versa. By neglecting the issue of misinformation, this bill falls short of comprehensively tackling the challenges brought about by the digital era. It refuses to even attempt to safeguard the integrity of news consumption and democratic discourse, and instead sides with news conglomerates who are going to end up bleeding themselves dry by trying to pull a greedy stunt like this. It's important that policymakers proactively recognize and address this growing problem head-on and learn to read the room. So in conclusion, I do not like the Online News Act. I think it's a very bad thing. I believe it harms smaller news companies, and I especially believe that it harms Canadian citizens who are trying to get information on the internet. Thank you for listening to this episode of Orange Wave. I am your host, Will Adams. I hope you have an amazing day, and remember, Jagmeet Singh loves you.